Today, I would like us to look at the life of Joseph and see how God's presence made a difference in his life. The first thing I'd like us to remember about God's presence is that God's presence offers us protection. Because of God's presence, Joseph's life was protected even when his brothers planned to get rid of him. Genesis 37 verse 17 to 28. They have moved on from here. The man answered, I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they say to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into this cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hand on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. God's presence protected him from the harm that had been planned against him. And dear ones, I am here to remind you that God's presence with you is able to protect you from all dangers. You may be anxious, you do not know what the year holds. You may be a little bit anxious, you do not know what is going to happen to your family. You may be a little bit anxious, you don't know what is going to happen in your school. But God is able to protect you even in the midst of the dangers and the uncertainties of life. Oh yes, all you need is His presence. Apart from protection, God's presence also offers preservation. Preservation has to do with, in a way, being kept safe from harm, very close to protection. But it has to do also with maintaining something in its current state, or leaving something as is, or leaving something or someone intact. In spite of the many challenges Joseph went through, God's presence again somehow, somewhere preserved him. And in Genesis chapter 39 from verse 6, to verse 21, we see how he ends up somehow in prison for a mistake he hasn't even done. But God still preserves him in prison, because God's presence is not limited. God's presence is with him even in his troubles. Look at verse 20 and 21 of Genesis 39. The Bible says, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And friends, be confident. Fear not. God's presence is there to preserve us even in the midst of the vicissitudes of life. His presence is there to preserve us. Yes, God's presence protects. God's presence preserves. But there's yet another thing that God's presence can do in one's life. And that is, it can lead to promotion. A sense of moving forward. A sense of becoming better. A sense of increase in life. Genesis 39, from verse 1 to 4. This is what the Bible says. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. The Lord was with Joseph and he got promoted, in other words. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household. He entrusted to his care everything he owned. Hey people, you know what? Promotion does not come from the east or the west. Promotion comes from the Lord. Oh yes, promotion comes from God. And this man in a foreign land is not only protected, it's not just preserved, but he's promoted. And lastly, you know, God's presence in Joseph's life brings provision to him and to others. Verse 25 of Genesis 42. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. He has received God's provision, even in a strange land, that he has so much that he's able to give, to share. This is God's supernatural provision to Joseph, and he is so happy to share with others. You know what? His presence that was with Joseph then is with us even today to provide for us so that we have enough, not just for ourselves, but to share with others, to bless others. The way Joseph had so much provisions that he shared with his family, that he provided for his, father. He provided for his brothers and their families. Again, I remind us, we can count on God's protection. We can count on God's preservation. We can count on God's promotion. We can also count on God's provision.